Years ago, there was a pretty popular writer by the name of Annie Dillard. And she wrote in one of her books these words. It was a book called The Writing Life. She says, "How we spend our days, of course, is how we spend our lives." Let that sink in for a moment. I'm going to repeat that. How we spend our days, of course, is how we spend our lives. And for most of us, we spend most of our working or our waking hours, day in, day out, at work. Many of us spend a whole lot of time, conscious effort and energy directed or devoted to our work. And so I thought it would be helpful for us to think about how our work relates to God's work. That's what this series has been all about, how our work is related to God's work, because we are the hands and feet of Jesus. So I began this series on Labor Day weekend, and I'm finishing it today. It's called God at Work. And I thought what I would do as I preach on this last sermon called Fruitful versus Successful, I thought I would give a highlight or a recap of the entire series and highlight for you the major points of each week and the sermon. So here we are, week 1, as I talked about God at work. The first sermon was entitled The Gift of Work. And work is a real broad term, but I decided to define it according to my dictionary app on my computer. And we went with this definition. As a noun, work is activity, any activity involving mental or physical effort done in order to achieve some kind of purpose or result. And I talked about several times during the series how our work can be paid or unpaid. It can be in the home or outside of the home. And what I've learned, many of you are retired, and you have told me over and over that you're working more now in your retirement than you ever did in your so-called working life. All work matters to God. That was the highlight of that sermon. And I reminded us how connected we are through human work. Think about the shirt on your very back and all the people involved all across the world in making that piece of material. And we talked about how in our culture we tend to talk about, we put work into tiers, like we categorize blue collar work from white collar work, if you have it. And I want to just say to you, to God, biblically speaking, all work matters. All work has dignity. And the Bible talks about work. In the beginning, the very first chapter, the very first verse, we learned that God is working. God creates the heavens and the earth in a regular 7-day work week. And because we are created in the image of God, we were designed, you and I, as human beings, we have been designed to work. Tim Keller, in this book, Every Good Endeavor, he warns us. I'll hold that up so you can see it. He warns us in this book to not let our work dictate our self-worth. Many of us, because we work so much, we devote so much of our time and energy to it, if we're not careful, we can over-identify with our work. And he says, when that happens, when you're successful at your work, it goes to your head, and you think you're better, superior, smarter than all the rest. And then he says, if you're not successful at your work, if you over-identify with it and you're not successful, then it goes to your heart, and you feel like a worthless failure. The way this manifests in my own job, the job of, let's say, preaching. Somebody was asking me this weekend, I had a pretty busy weekend traveling and got back late last night, and someone said to me, Claire, why don't you just preach an old sermon? You never do that. Why don't you? And my head says, well, a sermon has the shelf life of a loaf of bread, about 3 days. And after that, it gets a little stale, leftovers. That's my head talking. My heart says, well, of all the 20 plus years of preaching, I really don't think I've ever said anything that, deserves to be repeated. And, in reality, there's a balance there. Both are somewhat true and both are somewhat not true. But we don't want to over-identify with our work. Tim Keller says, don't let your work be the currency of your self-esteem. What a great quote. Let me say it again. Don't let your work be the currency of your self-esteem. And I'm here to remind you that our identity is not based on our work. It's based on our belonging to God. And our key verse today comes from John's Gospel, the 15th chapter, where Jesus says to remain in me, because God, I am the vine and you are the branches. That's what defines us. That's what is to shape who we are. And I could stop right there and that would be the end of the sermon, and I know that would make some of you very happy. But my job is not to get up here and entertain you or say anything all that brilliant. My job here is to remind us week in, week out, because we live in a world that doesn't believe this. My job is to remind you of your true worth is in your belonging, your safety, your salvation. Your wholeness is shaped by your belonging to God. So that was the first week, got the gift of work. The second week, I talked about the importance of keeping Sabbath. And what I mean by this is a 24-hour Sabbath. And some of you are like, woo, you got to be kidding me. You're not married, Claire. You don't know what it's like. The reason I talk about this is because it's biblical. Of the 10 commandments, it's in there. And not only is it one of the commandments, it's one of the longest commandments and the most specific. And you know from Scripture how God created the heavens and the earth, and then on the seventh day, God did what? Rested. Not only that, God looked back and said, wow, that's pretty good. Really good. And so we're to have a day where we do that, where we look back and we're like, wow. And Peter Scazzaro says what we do on a 24-hour Sabbath each week is we stop, we rest, we take delight, and we contemplate. And we're to let others rest, by the way. If you're a parent out there, if you're a grandparent, let your children rest. And if you're an employer and you have people working for you, or you have friends that you work a lot like I do, let them rest. It's important that everyone gets a break. We're to keep things in balance. Again, Peter Scazzaro says the goal here is to work from our rest, not rest from our work. Sabbath keeping is not another day off. It's to establish such a rhythm that everything that we do, all of our activity is flowing from a full cup in God. Now, the third week I talked about interruptions, and if you're at work, the last thing you want, or the last thing I want, hint, 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 is an interruption. And I shared with you that studies have said that the average employee experiences as many as 56 interruptions a day, costing the U.S. economy around $588 billion a year. $1 billion, by the way. But as it turns out, in the Bible, there are many, many divine interruptions. And if you look at the life of Jesus, and you read the Gospels, you look at his public ministry, he is constantly being interrupted. And so, the dean of Duke Chapel, his name is the Reverend Dr. Luke Powery, he talks about the importance of shifting from a purpose-driven to a person-driven life. Jesus had a purpose. It was to usher in the kingdom of God here on earth. And he was serious about that purpose. But how he went about that purpose, if you watch him day in, day out, is by being person-driven. And we are to do the same. And that leads us, each of these sermons hopefully have built on each other. And it's led us to our sermon today called Fruitful versus Successful. And my sermon thesis today, and please always remember, I preach most what I most and first and foremost need to hear. And here's the thesis. Life is not a competition. That's what I want us to remember today. Life is not a competition. And yet we live in a very competitive world. You know, we live in such a world that causes us to believe that if I'm going to be happy, if I'm going to have a joyous, abundant life, then I am going to be successful, right? And my joy says I'm different. You know, we even say that to each other. We say it in the church. I just want to make a what? Difference. Because if we stand out, if we're different than all the rest, then we will be successful. I got this metaphor I'm about to share with you from the late, great Henry Nouwen. And I'm going to draw for you, so if we can get the camera to direct here to our pad here. When I'm thinking about success, this comes to mind. I'm going to draw it for you. Anybody recognize this? The Olympics. And what happens here? We've got, this is important, first place, second place, and third. Now, do you want to know the difference between first place and second place? You know what that is? Usually it's around a half a second. You know, in the Olympics, I was thinking about this race that went all the way back to 2008 in Beijing, Summer Olympics. You remember Michael Phelps, great swimmer? How could we forget? And so he's trying to beat Mark Spitz's record for the most gold medals in an Olympic Games. And he's getting to his last race. It was the 100-meter butterfly. And he's swimming the race. It's very close. And when they get to the end of the race, this is the image. He doesn't even know himself. Nobody could tell with the naked eye who won that race, not even Michael Phelps. It took modern-day technology, which is an electronic timer, to prove that Michael Phelps had won his 7th gold medal that year. And you know how much he won that race by, the 100-meter butterfly? 1/100th of a second. I am the gold medal winner. You are just a silver medal winner. And you, my friend, are bronze. We do this, right? C.S. Lewis calls this pride, not success. A proud person, he says, in Mere Christianity, one of his classic books, is always looking down on things and on others. I want to read this quote. I think we have it on the screen. C.S. Lewis says, "Pride gets no pleasure out of having something, only out of having more of it than the next person. We say people are proud of being rich or clever or good looking, but they are not. They are proud of being richer or cleverer or better looking than the others." We're talking today about how our work relates to God's work, because after all, you and I are the hands and feet of Jesus. And our key verse today comes from John's Gospel, the 15th chapter. "I am the vine, you are the branches, and those who remain in me, and I in them, bear much fruit. Because apart from me, you can do what? Nothing." Get this. Jesus does not call us, church, to be successful. Jesus calls us to be fruitful. And we need to understand how these two differ. Again, we want the Lord to make us different. We want to stand out from all the rest. We want to be the best. We want to make a difference. And you know, I've started praying differently for this church. I've always prayed for this church. I've always asked for God to guide me, for God to guide Cleo, our staff, our leaders, our members, all connected with our church. Please guide us. But I would also pray for things like help us be successful. In my heart, what I was really saying was, I want us to be the best church ever, you know, the biggest, the best. But over the years, I have decided that that's not really a faithful prayer. And so I'm praying something quite different. And it's much braver, a much braver prayer. And now when I pray every single morning, Lord, guide us. And also, Lord, make us fruitful. Lord, make us fruitful. From time to time, I don't know if y'all know this, but I have been at ministry for a while now. I'm considered one of the seasoned pastors, you know. I'm not that younger clergy person anymore. So people come to me. Just last week, I had someone call me from the ministry in our church that helps people get ordained, and they said, "We want you to share your wisdom with a few candidates." And so I said, okay. And we were talking about ministry and what to do, what not to do, and we were talking about what does it mean to be fruitful in ministry. And one thing I shared was, don't do what I did. As you're leading your churches, don't be what I would call a fruit inspector. You're always going around going, you got fruit? I didn't say that, but I'm looking around for the fruit. I want to know if you're successful or if you're productive, if you're producing fruit. You see, I don't believe the gospel is inviting us to be fruit inspectors. I think the gospel is inviting us to be fruit bearers, sharers of the fruit. I think I know it is, the Apostle Paul. In his letter to the Ephesians, he's talking to the church about the importance of being unified in the bond of peace. Not uniformed, we talked about that this summer, but he's begging them to understand their witness depends on their unity in the bond of peace. And in that context, he says to them, bear with one another in love. Read that with me, church. Bear with one another in love. Henry Nouwen says, fruit comes out of broken ground. You see, our fruit emerges. It grows out of the cross, out of shared vulnerability. Thinking about the Cowells this morning, little Ellie, a new miracle in our community now. And how did Ellie come to us? Two young people fell in love and were intimate and vulnerable with one another, and then they bared fruit. I'm thinking about emotionally healthy discipleship, and when we come together around those tables and we share vulnerably, fruit begins to emerge. It's hard to see it and recognize it, but we can sense it. I think about my own preaching and how some of you wrote to me this very week. You said, thank you so much. Your openness, your transparency really enhances your preaching. And that's because you don't want to know it all, got it all figured out, pulled together kind of preacher. You want someone who will walk alongside you and doesn't have all the answers. Fruit comes from our shared vulnerability. But we think our joy will come from success by being different and better than all the rest. And Jesus says, no, your joy, listen, church, your joy comes from being like everyone else. You're part of the human race. How incredible is that? And so the call is not to compete. The call is to be compassionate. You know where that word comes from? I believe it's the Latin. Come, I think we have a slide for this, means with. Passion means suffer. We are called to suffer with one another. This is what will bring fruit that will last. I wrap up with a few words about another spiritual mentor of mine. His name is the Reverend Will Campbell. He joined the church triumphant in 2013, summer of 2013, and he was a bit of an odd duck of a preacher. He was called a bootlegger preacher because he liked to drink cheap whiskey. He was Southern Baptist, and he served one church. So they call him I got to look this up, the steeple dropout. He served in Taylor, Louisiana, small little town, Baptist church, and it just didn't suit him, church politics, I guess. And so he dropped out and went to the University of Mississippi during the height of the civil rights. And they didn't like how he cared about everybody, and he stood up for all, and so they kicked him out. And so he started writing. And he's written lots of novels, and he's written lots of books, and he has shaped in profound ways many seminarians. I got to meet him because we had a mutual friend in Oxford, Mississippi, and we shared a meal and a little glass of Evan Williams. And I remember that he used to teach this, every preacher, they say, has one sermon. And his one sermon, again, was you have to love everybody, including and especially your enemies. And if you have people in your community that hate you and they mistreat you, so what? God loves them, so should you. And so what he modeled in the 60s was so profound. He befriended and loved members of the KKK and members of the NAACP. And he said this once in a letter to someone. The issue is not right or wrong, justice or injustice, good or bad. It is human tragedy. And in a tragedy, you cannot take up sides. You just have to minister to the hurt wherever you find it. Church, I'd rather call you friends. You and I here at First United Methodist Church of Gulfport, we are not here to make a difference. We're not here to stand out above all the rest. You know what we're here to do? We are here to belong, to be in compassion, to have compassion for the entire human race. And I don't care what other churches are doing down the road, in the district, and beyond. I really don't care, because I'm convinced 100% more than ever what God is calling us to do. And that has nothing to do with our success. And it has everything to do with our being fruitful. And the only way you and I can be fruitful, and that we can be fruitful as a community of faith, is if we abide. We have to remain in intimate, steadfast, loving communion with Jesus and our neighbor. Even the ones that mistreat us or talk about us or we don't like that much. You know, Bishop Swanson, our own bishop now, says, when you turn on the porch light, all kind of critters show up. So I close with a story from The Glad River by Will Campbell. It's a novel about a community, a neighborhood of friends, and they were sort of stuck together, and they just found a way to tolerate but also love each other. And one in the friendship, there are 3 friends, and one in the friendship dies. And they're standing at the graveside, and 2 friends are above the ground, and one, of course, is not. And here's what one of the friends says in a eulogy about this neighbor, the deceased. What the giver gave so freely, we now return. He did not make 80 years and 10, but the visit, meaning the visit in this life, is not measured in terms of longevity. We had good times together and bad. We laughed together and we cried together. We confessed our cares in unlikely places. We worked and piddled, sat on rushing riverbanks in the hills, and whiled away many a summer afternoon on sleeping bayous. We read books and we learned to talk like each other. And we argued about trivial things and took hard counsel about the things that mattered. But mostly, we just loved one another. How we spend our days, of course, is how we spend our lives. So be it, and so it is. Amen.